The candles in the east ballroom of Ashmore Hall burned in rows of 12 along each wall, and their light caught the diamonds at Miss Cecily Ford's throat with a brightness that seemed, to the 40 persons assembled that February evening, almost ordained, almost inevitable, as though the jewels had always belonged to that neck, in that room, before that particular crowd of neighbors and lesser gentry who had come, ostensibly, to welcome the new season, and who had come, in truth, to witness Lady Maren Ashmore confirm what she had been quietly engineering for the better part of a year. Charlotte watched from the doorway to the service corridor, a tray of emptied champagne coupes balanced in her hands, her gray wool gown as plain as ash against the room's saturated warmth. She was 23 years old. She had worked inside these walls for 6 years. No one in that ballroom turned to look at her. What she did not yet know was that one man already had. She had come to Ashmore Hall at 17, the circumstances of her arrival packaged into a story so tidy it had never invited questions. An orphan from a country clergyman's household, suitable for service. Lady Maren had installed her as a junior housemaid, and, recognizing her steadiness and her silence, elevated her to lady's maid within 2 years. Charlotte had accepted the elevation with the same quiet she brought to everything at Ashmore. Gratitude measured carefully so as not to tip into presumption, efficiency measured carefully so as not to tip into visibility. 6 years of gray wool and downcast eyes, and yes, my lady. 6 years of moving through the house that ought, by every instrument of law and blood, to have been hers. She did not think of it in those terms. She had trained herself not to. The wound of it was too old and too deep to be touched without cost, and she had long ago built a surface above it that was neat, serviceable, and would not crack in company. Her mother, she had been told, was a woman of no consequence. Her father was never named. These were the terms of her existence at Ashmore, and she had made her peace with them the way a person makes peace with a low ceiling. Not by pretending it was not there, but by learning precisely how to move beneath it without lifting her head. What she had never been told was that her mother had been Miss Eleanor Hadley, daughter of a Wiltshire baronet, and that her father had been Francis Vane, the late Duke of Ashmore, and that the two of them had married in a private ceremony in the chapel at Wiltshire in the autumn of 1801, with only a young curate and one elderly housekeeper in attendance as witnesses. What she had never been told was that the royal letters patent confirming that marriage and its legitimate issue had been in existence since before her birth, and that those letters had been in the private custody of Mr. Silas Croft, Lady Maren's solicitor, for the entirety of her 6 years at Ashmore, and that Croft had kept them there with the same deliberate silence one gives to a document that is inconvenient to produce. Nora Briggs had been that elderly housekeeper. She was still at Ashmore, 71 years old now, her hands stiff at the knuckles, her hearing soft at the edges, and her memory of that ceremony in the Wiltshire chapel as precise and unworn as the day it had been laid down. She had kept her silence because Lady Maren had told her, in a conversation Charlotte would not learn about until later, that any word of it would see her turned from the hall without a reference and without a pension. Nora had 3 grandchildren and a daughter in poor health. She had kept her silence. It had cost her every morning for 6 years. On the evening of the first ball of the season, none of this was visible in Charlotte's face as she carried her tray through the doorway and back along the service corridor toward the kitchen. What was visible to anyone who had been watching the service doorway with the specific quality of attention one does not usually deploy at country balls was the precise moment she paused at the threshold to let a footman pass with a fresh bottle, and the way the candlelight from the ballroom caught her profile for 3 full seconds before the door swung closed behind her. Edmund Wycliffe, Duke of Ravenport had been watching that doorway because he had been standing at the far end of the room with a glass of claret he did not intend to drink. Watching the room in general with the measured disengagement of a man who has been to enough of these evenings to know that nothing requires his close attention until something does. He was 36 years old, lean and dark, his jaw carrying the kind of stillness that comes not from indifference, but from long practice at restraint. His estate at Ravenport bordered Ashmore's eastern edge, which was why Lady Marin had included him in the 40 persons present. He was useful in the room. His presence lent weight to the occasion without requiring him to participate in it with any sincerity. He understood this role and fulfilled it without resentment. He had not expected the gray-gowned woman in the service doorway. He had not expected the tray or the profile or the 3 seconds of candlelight. And when the door closed and she was gone, he found himself holding the claret glass a fraction tighter than he had before, and not entirely certain why. Lady Marin moved through the room in black silk and Ashmore pearls, Cecily installed at her right hand like a proof of something already established. Cecily was 20 years old, her father a wealthy baron from Gloucester, her manner polished to the specific sheen that results from 12 years of being told one is the correct choice. She smiled at the room, and the room smiled back. Lady Marin's voice, carrying the particular precision of a woman who has learned that her words land differently from others, said something about the new season, and something about Ashmore's future, and something about the pleasure of proper stewardship, and the assembled company nodded in the way. One nods when the social math is already settled, and the vote is ceremonial. Ravenport watched Cecily smile and thought it was a fine smile, and also that it understood its own fineness rather too well. He set down his untouched claret. The first voicing of the label came from Mrs. Harton, a neighbor's wife with a face like pressed linen, who said it to the woman beside her in a tone that was not quite private. The little maid who brings the glasses. Rather a plain thing. Marin keeps her useful. The woman beside her agreed in the tone one uses to agree when something costs nothing, and the exchange was over in 4 seconds. And Charlotte, passing back through the service door with a clean tray, did not hear it. Ravenport, who was closer than Mrs. Harton had estimated, did. He looked at the door that had closed again. He looked at Mrs. Harton. He looked at his own reflection, faint and dark, in the night-black window glass at the far end of the room. Something about the casual ease of it settled in him the way cold water settles, finding the low places. The fan came down 3 days later, which is how Ravenport learned her name. Lady Marin had organized a small afternoon gathering in the drawing room, ostensibly for the ladies of the party to review fabric samples for the spring fittings, actually to give Cecily another opportunity to be observed against the furniture and the light in a context that did not require her to do anything except exist attractively. Ravenport was present because he had called that afternoon on a matter of the eastern boundary fence, which had been in dispute since the previous autumn, and had been ushered into the drawing room rather than the study, because the study was occupied with Mr. Croft and his documents. He stood near the window, waiting for Lady Marin to finish her sentence. Cecily's ivory fan slipped from her lap when she turned to take a teacup, and it fell in an arc to the floor, and Charlotte, who was standing 3 feet away with a small arrangement of silver scissors and thread in her hands, moved before anyone else had registered the fall. She bent with the particular economy of someone accustomed to moving in spaces that do not accommodate large gestures, retrieved the fan, and held it out toward Cecily without looking up, her fingers careful not to soil the ivory. "Thank you," Cecily said, in the tone one uses with furniture that has been obliging. Charlotte said nothing and returned to her position at the wall. Ravenport had been watching from the window. He had seen the speed of her attention, the precision of the movement, the particular care with which she handled the fan as though it were someone else's property, and therefore deserving of more respect than her own. He had seen the quality of Cecily's thanks. He had watched Charlotte receive that thanks with a face that revealed nothing. He asked Lady Maren quietly, as she passed him on her way to the writing table, "The maid. What is her name?" Lady Maren looked at him with an expression that registered the question as faintly irregular. "Charlotte," she said. "Charlotte Vane. She is my lady's maid. Quite capable." "Vane," he repeated, in the tone of a man filing something. Lady Maren moved on. Charlotte, at the wall, had not heard the exchange. She was counting the threads on a torn flounce and thinking about Agnes. Agnes was 14, newly come from the village, and she was a housemaid of the sort that is perpetually one small accident away from catastrophe. Earnest to the point of clumsiness, careful to the point of paralysis, so frightened of making errors that she made them constantly. She had broken a small china figure in the second-floor landing 2 mornings before, and Mr. Croft, who had no authority over Ashmore's household staff, but whose position as Lady Maren's solicitor gave him the confidence to behave as though he did, had told Lady Maren that the girl ought to be turned away before she broke something worth keeping. Charlotte had been in the linen room when she heard Croft delivering this verdict in the corridor outside, his voice carrying the disinterest of a man performing a small administrative function. She had come out of the linen room with the pressed sheets still in her arms. "Mr. Croft," she said, and her voice was level. "Agnes is new to the house. She will learn." The figure that broke was placed at the edge of the table, which was itself placed too close to the landing. "The fault is shared." She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. "I will speak to Lady Maren about Agnes's position myself." Croft looked at her. His face did something brief and calculating, a single short interior movement the narrator marks only as this. He did not expect resistance from that quarter. "As you like," he said, and moved on. Agnes, who had been standing in the doorway to the back staircase, and had heard every word, looked at Charlotte with an expression that combined gratitude and terror in roughly equal parts. Ravenport was at the far end of the corridor, having just descended from his meeting with Lady Maren in the upper sitting room. He had been close enough to hear Charlotte's 2 sentences to Croft. He had been close enough to see that she was shaking, faintly, in her hands. Though the sheets she carried were held perfectly still, he did not make himself known. He walked to the front of the house and stood at the portico in the February cold for a moment, before he called for his horse. He had not been this close to Croft since the matter of his ward, Miss Louisa Pemberton, and her mother's estate in Somerset. That had been 3 years ago. Croft had held the family's documents in the same private capacity he now served for Lady Maren, and certain instruments had been misplaced, and certain records had not come forward in time, and Louisa's inheritance from her maternal grandmother had been awarded to a cousin who should not have received it. The loss had been £12,000 of income, approximately the annual value of the Ashmore estate itself. The procedural remedies had failed because the documents could not be produced. The documents had not been produced because Croft had not produced them. Ravenport had known it. He had not been able to prove it. The knowledge had settled in him in the years since and become part of his architecture. A distrust of private document custody, a wariness of men whose utility to powerful households made them untouchable, and a very specific recognition of the face that Croft wore when he was asked a question he did not want to answer. He had seen that face in the corridor. He had also seen a young woman in gray wool who had not backed down from it. He stood in the February cold and breathed carefully, and tried not to decide anything too quickly. Inside, Charlotte spoke to Lady Maren about Agnes. Lady Maren heard her out with the patience of a woman who has made larger decisions and does not wish to spend her attention on small ones. Agnes was permitted to stay. Charlotte thanked her and returned to her work. What neither of them saw was Croft, watching from the end of the upper gallery as Charlotte left the sitting room, his expression carrying that same brief interior movement, sharper now, and no longer quite so small. If you are already drawn into Charlotte's story, stay close. What happens next will not let you go easily. 3 mornings after the Agnes incident, Lady Marin sent Charlotte to sort a trunk of outerwear that had been moved from the upper dressing room to the small anteroom off the ground floor during some rearrangement of Cecily's accommodations. There were cloaks and mantles and 3 pairs of gloves among the items requiring assessment, and Charlotte worked through them with her usual methodical quiet. Inspect, fold, set aside for repair or storage. The 3rd glove, a pale kidskin glove from a pair that had been worn once and discarded with the careless confidence of someone accustomed to discarding things, had a small tear along the inner seam. Charlotte turned it inside out to assess the mending, and something shifted inside the lining. She pressed the fabric flat and felt the raised impression of a seal through the kid skin. She looked at the door. She was alone. She eased the lining carefully, because her instinct was always to handle other people's property with more care than her own. The paper inside was folded 4 times, its edges slightly soft from the years it had been enclosed, its surface intact. She opened it at the first fold and read the heading at the top, and read it again, because the first reading did not arrange itself into sense. Letters patent. The Crown's mark. The year 1801. The names: Francis William Vane, Duke of Ashmore, and Eleanor Grace Hadley, spinster of the county of Wiltshire. The words lawful and canonical marriage and legitimate issue, and a date in October, 6 weeks before Charlotte's own birthday. She sat down on the floor of the anteroom because her legs made that decision before she did. The kid skin glove lay across her knee. The February light through the small window was cold and very clear. Her name was not Charlotte Vane, lady's maid. Her name was Charlotte Vane, daughter of the Duke of Ashmore. Legitimate. Named in royal letters patent. The title was hers. The hall was hers. The £12,000 per annum of the Ashmore estate was hers, had been hers for 23 years, and had been administered in her name by a woman who had known this document existed and had kept it inside a glove in a trunk in an anteroom. She folded the letters patent and placed them inside the bodice of her gray wool gown, against her sternum, and she sat in the cold light for a few minutes more and let herself feel the weight of 6 years of yes. My lady pressing down on her chest alongside the paper, and she breathed through it until she could stand. She went looking for Nora Briggs. She found her in the still room, checking the inventory of dried lavender, and she closed the door and stood before the old woman and asked her, quietly, if she had been at the Wiltshire Chapel in October of 1801. Nora's hands stopped moving among the lavender bundles. Her face went through something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but carried elements of both. She sat down on the still-room stool, and she looked at Charlotte with eyes that had been carrying a secret for 6 years, like a stone in a closed fist, and she opened her hand. Yes, she had been there. She had signed her name as witness. She had been told afterward by Lady Marin that if she ever spoke of it, she would be turned from the hall and her daughter's family with her. She had believed it. She still believed it. But Charlotte was holding those letters patent, and Charlotte was looking at her with an expression that contained no accusation and a great deal of steadiness. And Nora found that the weight she had been carrying was heavier than the weight she would carry by setting it down. She told Charlotte everything: the ceremony, the curate's name, her own signature in the register. The way Lady Marin, upon learning of the marriage after the late Duke's death, had gone directly to Croft. The way Croft had come to Nora 2 weeks later with his proposal. which was not phrased as a proposal, but functioned as one. Charlotte listened without interrupting. When Nora was finished, Charlotte put her hand over the old woman's and said, "You have done nothing wrong. None of this is your fault." She meant it precisely and without performance. That evening, Lady Marin summoned Charlotte to the upper sitting room. Her expression was composed, but there was a tension in the set of her shoulders that Charlotte, who had studied that particular posture for 6 years, recognized as the specific strain of a plan encountering friction. "I have decided," Lady Marin said, looking past Charlotte's left ear in the way she looked past things she did not wish to address directly, "that your services at Ashmore will no longer be required after the end of this month. I will provide a reference, naturally. You have been capable." She folded her hands. "Mr. Croft has identified a household in Derbyshire that may suit." Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. "I see," she said. "I trust this is satisfactory." "I will consider my position," Charlotte said, which was not agreement, and which Lady Marin heard clearly as not agreement, and which made the tension in Marin's shoulders sharpen by the width of a thread. Charlotte went back to her room in the servants' quarter, which was a room she had occupied for 6 years, and which she had never once decorated with anything personal, because she had learned early that personal objects at Ashmore invited questions about the owner's permanence. She sat on the narrow bed with the letters patent on her knee and thought about what she was willing to do, and what it would cost, and whether she was prepared to pay it. The second ball of the season was set for the following Friday. 40 persons again, with additional guests from 2 neighboring estates. Lady Marin had arranged it as the occasion on which Cecily's position would be formally articulated, though the articulation would be performative rather than legal, a social confirmation of what was already presented as established fact. Charlotte knew, because she had dressed Cecily 3 times now and had heard the conversations conducted over her head while she worked, that Marin intended to announce Cecily as the intended Duchess of Ashmore before the assembled company, closing the matter by force of public consensus. Ravenport was among the invited guests. Charlotte knew this because she had seen his name on the card list. She did not know what he would do with the information, or whether he would do anything at all, or whether she had any reason to expect anything from a man who had asked for her name once and had watched her speak to Croft in a corridor and had, as far as she could measure, returned to his estate and his boundary fence dispute and his own affairs. She did not expect anything from him. She had stopped expecting things from powerful men when she was 17 and had come to understand the terms of her installation at Ashmore. What she expected was from herself, and what she had decided she was capable of was walking into that ballroom on Friday evening and naming what she was, in front of the 40 persons assembled, with the letters patent in her hand, and Nora Briggs prepared to speak if she was asked to speak. It was the most frightening thing she had ever decided. Her hands were perfectly steady when she decided it. Friday evening arrived with the coldness of a February that had made up its mind. The carriages on the gravel. The candles in their rows. Cecily in pale gold silk and the Ford diamonds, which were almost as bright as the Ashmore pearls that Lady Marin wore for the occasion. Charlotte dressed them both, as she had been doing, and she performed this function with the same care she always brought to other people's property. She was wearing her gray wool gown, as always. She had pressed it that afternoon until it held its shape with a kind of quiet dignity. She had placed the letters patent inside her own glove, her one good pair of evening gloves that she wore only when required to stand at the edge of formal rooms, the seal's raised impression visible against the inner lining if one thought to look. She had not thought of this as ceremony. She had thought of it as keeping the document safe on her person, which was the most practical place for it. The room filled. Mrs. Harton arrived, and the Aldershot family from the neighboring estate, and Sir Philip Graves with his wife and eldest daughter, and a number of other faces Charlotte had been invisible to for 6 years. Ravenport arrived late, which was his habit, and he came in without looking around the room for anyone in particular, which was also his habit, and then he looked around the room and found her immediately, which was not. She was standing at the edge of the service corridor again. He crossed the room toward Lady Marin, but did not take the direct route, which brought him within 4 feet of Charlotte. He did not stop. He said nothing. What he did was check his own pace for exactly 1 stride as he passed her, a single fractional hesitation that was invisible to anyone not watching him specifically. And Charlotte, who had not expected it, felt it in her sternum like a second weight, alongside the folded paper. Lady Marin called the room's attention at 9 o'clock. The company arranged itself in the natural way of people accustomed to taking direction from the social authority in a room, and Lady Marin stood with Cecily at her right hand and spoke about the Ashmore title and its future, and the importance of proper continuity. And her voice was the voice of a woman who has never in her adult life been publicly contradicted, and therefore does not construct her sentences to allow for contradiction. Charlotte walked into the room, not through the service door, through the main door from the corridor. She crossed from the perimeter toward the center with the same economy of movement she had always used, but she did not stop at the perimeter, and she did not lower her eyes. And when she had reached a position where the full company could see her, she stopped and spoke in a voice that was not large, but that was very clear. "I beg your pardon, Lady Marin," she said. "I have something to present to this company." The room produced the particular silence that has never been comfortable. Lady Marin looked at her for a moment with an expression that was simultaneously surprised and not surprised at all. The expression of someone watching a clock strike an hour she had hoped would not arrive. "Charlotte." Her voice held exactly the weight she needed it to hold, which was the weight of 6 years of hierarchy between them. "This is not the appropriate moment." "I understand that," Charlotte said. "Nevertheless." She drew off her right glove. "Tio." The laughter began before she could unfold the paper. It came from Mrs. Harton first, and then from 2 men near the window, whose names Charlotte had never been told because they had never seen the need to introduce themselves to her, and it spread through the room with the speed of things that have been given permission. Quiet at first, then broader, then a woman's voice. Mrs. Aldershot saying with the specific pleasure of someone who has needed this kind of confirmation all evening, "The little maid. She is claiming the Ashmore title. Good Lord, listen to her." There it was, the same label, in the same room where it had been established, voiced now before every person in the house. Cecily's face arranged itself into something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity, but was familiar with the territory between them. Lady Marin's expression closed like a shutter. Charlotte held the glove in her left hand and the folded letters patent in her right, and the laughter was still present in the room, and her face was composed and still, and she said, over it, "These letters patent were issued by the Crown in 1801. They confirm the legitimate marriage of Francis William Vane, Duke of Ashmore, and Eleanor Grace Hadley. I am their daughter. I have been in service in this house for 6 years. The paper trembled once in her hands. She could not entirely prevent it. "That document is a fabrication," Croft said from the edge of the group near Lady Marin, his voice precise and dismissive, and carrying the particular confidence of a man who has spent years suppressing the truth of a thing, and therefore believes absolutely in his ability to go on suppressing it. "I have examined the Ashmore papers comprehensively. There is no such marriage on record. The young woman has been misled." He looked at Charlotte directly, and his face said, as plainly as if he had spoken it aloud, "I have done this before, and you are not the first, and you will not be the last." Charlotte held his gaze. "Then perhaps," she said, You will explain the impression on the inner lining." She turned the glove outward, and the royal seal, pressed into the kid skin of the glove's lining from 23 years of proximity to the folded letters, fell free from the damaged inner seam and turned twice in the air and landed on the polished floor of the East Ballroom at Ashmore Hall, with a sound that was not loud but that every person in the room heard, because the laughter had already died and the room had been moving toward a particular kind of silence for the last 30 seconds, and the seal's landing was the sound that completed it. No one spoke. Croft looked at the seal on the floor. His face did the one thing the narrator permits it to do at this moment. He recognized that it was over. Lady Maren looked at the seal, and then at Charlotte, and then at the room. And what the room was doing was turning, not dramatically, not in unison, but the way a room turns when a social fact that has been established as permanent reveals itself as constructed, and the people inside it are individually calculating what they knew, and when they knew it, and what their faces have been expressing for the last several months. Mrs. Harton had gone very still. The two men near the window were no longer laughing. Edmund Wycliffe crossed the ballroom. He did not hurry. He covered the length of the room in a stride that was measured and deliberate, and the company parted for him with the reflexive deference that a duke's presence commands even in a room that belongs to someone else, and he came to stand beside Charlotte, not behind her, beside her. And he bent and picked up the royal seal from the floor and held it for a moment in his palm, and then looked up at the assembled company with the specific quality of stillness in his face. That was not coldness, but its cousin. Absolute clarity. This seal corresponds to the letters patent issued by the Crown in October of 1801, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has no need to raise it. I have examined instruments of this issue before, and I know the mark. I will stand as witness to its authenticity before any authority this company wishes to name. He turned the seal once in his hand. Charlotte Vane is the legitimate daughter of the late Duke of Ashmore. She has been so since before her birth. The title and the estate belong to her. He held out the seal to her. She took it. Their fingers did not quite touch, and then they did. Lady Maren said, "Your Grace, you cannot seriously intend," and then stopped, because Ravenport had looked at her with an expression that was entirely courteous and utterly final, and she heard, inside that expression, the precise location of the line he had drawn. Cecily stood at Maren's right hand, with a face that had emptied of its performance. She was 20 years old, and she had been told her whole life she was the correct choice, and for the first time she was standing in a room where that information was not functioning. And the recognition that crossed her face was brief and complicated, and almost, the beginning of something else. She took a step back. She did not require further displacement. Nora Briggs had come in from the service corridor during the commotion. No one had noticed. She stood near the door in her plain housekeeper's dress, and when Ravenport said Charlotte's name and title before the company, Nora put both hands over her mouth and closed her eyes for a moment. And when she opened them, her face was lighter than it had been in 6 years. Mr. Croft was escorted from the room by 2 of the Aldershot men at Ravenport's quiet request, a request delivered in 3 words that left no room for interpretation. The censure of his conduct would be pursued through appropriate channels, and those channels would move with the particular deliberateness of a machinery that had been waiting for this document to surface. The Pemberton matter in Somerset was also, as it happened, not entirely closed. Lady Maren remained in the room. She did not speak again that evening. She sat in the chair that had always been her chair at Ashmore, near the fire, very straight. and her face held the expression of a woman who has organized her entire life around a structure that has just been corrected in front of 40 persons, and who is old enough and intelligent enough to understand that the correction was not personal cruelty, but the weight of an actual fact exerting itself after 23 years of suppression. It was not a comfortable expression. It was also not without a kind of recognition at its edge. The look of someone who has made a calculation that held for a very long time, and has now, at last, failed to hold. Charlotte did not look at her with triumph. She looked at her with something more complicated and less satisfying, which was the look of someone who has spent 6 years in service to a woman who knew the truth and chose not to speak it, and who cannot quite decide whether she is more exhausted or more relieved. Outside, the February night had made up its mind about snow. It fell without hurry in the light from the hall's front windows, each flake catching the yellow glow for a moment before descending. The days that followed were full of solicitors and documents and procedural confirmations, each of which arrived with the gravity of a clock that has been running wrong for 23 years, being set to the correct time at last. Charlotte moved through them with the same quality she had brought to everything at Ashmore: steadiness, attention, and the specific efficiency of a person who has been solving other people's problems for 6 years and is now, for the first time, solving her own. Ravenport remained at Ashmore for a week beyond the ball, partly because the eastern boundary question required his attention, and partly because he did not leave. He was present at the 3 meetings with the solicitors from London, who came to confirm the letters patent and review the estate's administration. He was present when the documents from Croft's private custody were surrendered under instruction from the senior solicitor, and among those documents was a copy of the parish register from the Wiltshire chapel with Nora's signature on the witness line, her handwriting unchanged from the one on the deposition she provided that same afternoon. He did not manage these proceedings on Charlotte's behalf. He sat slightly to the left of them, available, watching Croft's former machinery disassemble itself, and when Charlotte looked across the table at him at the conclusion of the 3rd meeting, he gave her a single brief nod that said something between, "Yes, and it is done, and I was not going to let him do to you what he did to Louisa." She understood all 3 meanings. She did not say so. She thanked him, formally, in front of the London solicitor, and he accepted the thanks with the same restraint he brought to everything, and the solicitor looked between them and discreetly examined his papers. Cecily Ford departed Ashmore in her father's carriage on the Thursday following the ball. Charlotte was not present for the departure, having been occupied with the estate steward and the question of what a £12,000 per annum income looks like when it has been managed for 6 years by a woman who did not consider its legitimate owner's interests. Cecily left without incident, and if she looked back at the house as the carriage turned onto the main road, that look was her own, and no one else's business. Lady Maren remained at Ashmore in the dower house that was her legal residence. She did not interfere with Charlotte's meetings with the solicitors or the steward. She sent a note, 3 days after the ball, which contained 4 sentences. The first acknowledged the letters patent as authentic. The second expressed that she had believed her actions to be protective of the estate's integrity. The third did not quite apologize, but was in the general neighborhood of apology. The fourth asked whether she might remain in the dower house for the remainder of the season. Charlotte read the note twice, set it down, and wrote a reply of 3 sentences indicating that Lady Maren was welcome to remain as long as she wished, that the dower house was her legal residence in any case, and that Charlotte hoped they might find a way to conduct themselves with mutual civility going forward. She sealed the note without flourish and sent it by the afternoon post. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and it was not the absence of forgiveness either. It was the choice of a woman who had been raised, however involuntarily, inside these walls, and who knew that the hierarchy's machinery did not require more destruction on her behalf. What it required was an accurate accounting, and the accounting had been made, and the rest would be carried forward into ordinary time where ordinary relations could be attempted. Ravenport found her in the library on the Saturday afternoon, 2 days before he was finally obliged to return to his own estate. She was standing at the window with a letter in her hand, the afternoon light making her gray wool gown look almost warm, and she did not hear him in the doorway because she had been reading with the specific absorption of someone who has spent 6 years with very little that was properly hers to read. He knocked against the doorframe so as not to startle her, and she turned, and whatever was in his face in that moment was something she had not seen there before. A quality of looking that was not the measured watchfulness of the past 2 weeks, but something quieter and less protected. The face of a man who has been standing carefully to the left of something for some time and is no longer entirely certain he wants to go on standing that far away from it. "I am leaving on Monday," he said. "I know," she said. The steward mentioned the boundary survey. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her name alone, without title or prefix, and it landed in the room with the weight of a deliberate thing. "I would like to call at Ashmore," he said, "if you are willing to receive me. Not on a legal matter." She looked at him for a moment, and 6 years of trained expectation said, "Do not assume what he means. You have been wrong about what men mean before." And something else, something newer and quieter, and sitting directly over the place where the letter's patent had rested against her sternum for 2 days, said, "You know exactly what he means, and you know exactly what you feel, and you are 23 years old, and the hall is yours, and you are allowed to say yes. I would be glad," she said, "to receive you." The relief in his face was small and contained and entirely real. He left on Monday as arranged, and Charlotte stood at the upstairs window and watched his carriage take the east road through the park toward the boundary line and the Ravenport estate beyond it, and the snow that had begun on the night of the ball was still falling intermittently, settling on the formal garden and the gravel, and the long yew hedges with the patient impartiality of weather that has no opinion about what it covers. Spring arrived in fits and starts, as it always did in that part of the country, and Ravenport called at Ashmore with a regularity that the steward noted and the London solicitor referenced carefully in one of his letters, and that Nora Briggs noted with a satisfaction she did not attempt to conceal. He came twice in March, 3 times in April, and by May he was walking in the gardens with Charlotte in a manner that the household had stopped remarking on because it had become unremarkable, which is perhaps the most comfortable form of happiness, the kind that settles in without announcement and becomes, in time, simply the condition of the place. He proposed on a Tuesday in late May in the kitchen garden, which was not the setting either of them had imagined, because Charlotte had been examining a problem with the south wall's drainage, and he had been walking with her, and the conversation had moved naturally through its various rooms, including the room where he told her about Louisa Pemberton's inheritance and the 3 years he had spent knowing what Croft had done and being unable to prove it, and the room where she told him about the morning she had sat on the anteroom floor with the letters patent on her knee, and felt the weight of 6 years pressing down on her chest, and the room where neither of them was speaking, but both of them were standing in the same late May light, looking at the south wall's drainage problem with a quality of proximity that was no longer deniable by either party. He said it plainly, as he said everything, that he wished to marry her, that he was asking her rather than directing her, and that he was aware the distinction mattered. She said yes, The south wall's drainage problem remained unresolved until the following week. The wedding was small and quiet, and exactly what both of them preferred. A morning ceremony in the Ashmore Chapel. The curate who had replaced the one from 1801 in attendance. Nora Briggs in the front pew, with her hands folded and her eyes bright, the estate steward and two of the London solicitors standing at the back with the particular satisfaction of men who have completed a very long procedural matter and watched it resolve into something human. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. The luncheon that followed lasted considerably longer, because Nora had organized it, and Nora had opinions about quantities. That evening, when the guests had gone and the house had settled into its new quiet, Charlotte sat for a long time in the east room that had once been her father's study, and that she was only now, gradually, learning to think of as her own. A fire burned in the grate. The window across from it held the last of the May evening light, and beyond the glass the formal garden was soft with it, the yew hedges dark and still. Ravenport was in the chair beside hers, not reading, simply present, in the way he had been present for the past several months. Steady and watchful, and slightly to the left of where he needed to be, because the specific distance between his chair and hers had been diminishing in increments since February, and had, today, arrived at its destination. On the mantelpiece, in a small gilt frame, was a miniature of a woman Charlotte had never known. Eleanor Grace Hadley, painted in the year of her marriage. She had Charlotte's eyes, or Charlotte had hers, and the miniature had been found among the documents surrendered from Croft's private custody, along with the parish register and a small cache of her mother's letters. Charlotte had placed it on the mantelpiece on the morning she moved into the study. She had not yet told Ravenport why, and he had not yet asked. And the asking and the telling would come in their own time, because they had, for the first time in either of their lives, all the time they needed. The fire settled in the grate, with a sound like something releasing. Outside the window, the garden was quiet, and entirely hers. If Charlotte's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that mattered most. The stories that move you are the ones worth telling.